Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this online event organized by the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, oiip, based in Vienna. My name is Cengiz Günay, and I'm the Deputy Director of this institute. Today we are discussing the question of the returning of war to Europe. With a very distinguished panel, let me please introduce to you our panelists today. I'd like to start in the alphabetic order. Elias Götz from the Royal Danish Defense College, joining from Copenhagen. Hi, Elias.
Hi, Cengiz.
Hi, great to see you. Thank you for joining. Rinna Kullaa from the University of Tampere, and currently visiting professor at the University of Vienna, a historian. Hi, Rinna, joining from Helsinki.
Hello.
Hello, good to have you here. Thank you. Wolfgang Petritsch, the new president of our institute. We are very honored and proud. A career diplomat and former high representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also chief negotiator of the EU in the Kosovo question and war. Hello, Wolfgang. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. It's great to have you. And last but not least, Kristina Spohr, of course. I was just jumping to, sorry, Kristina, joining from Cambridge, professor at the London School of Economics. Hi, Kristina. Great to have you here.
Hi, Cengiz. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And last but not least, joining from Moscow, Dmitri Trenin from Carnegie, Moscow. Hello.
Thank you very much, Cengiz. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us. So what we'll be discussing today is that February 24th seemed to mark a turning point in recent history. It lastingly changed not only the lives of Ukrainians and also many Russians, but many Europeans and beyond. It seems to mark the end of the liberal world order, and also it questions whether multilateral approaches will be possible in any new future to global problems, regional problems. Is this the return to conventional warfare? We thought that we had left that beyond, where one state occupies another, or even the return to nuclear threats and arms race, or not? Are we kind of looking at it from a different point, as we're just in the middle of a development? Does actually February 24th mark a turning point, or did it actually start earlier? There are many people who say that actually the war in Georgia in 2008, or at least the Crimea question in 2014 marked a turning point, which were actually, or two historical turning points which were ignored by many observers. Is that true? And how does the war affect Russia, European stability, and European enlargement in the long term? These are some of the questions we would like to address today. I would, without further ado, I would like to give the word to Dmitri Trenin from Moscow. With the question is, how has the war, or as President Putin calls it, the special operation, affected life in Russia? And is this Putin's war, or does it go beyond his personality?
Well, Cengiz, life is going to change quite substantially in Russia. It has already changed. Certainly, Russians cannot travel to the countries that have closed their airspaces. And a lot of companies that used to employ people in places like Moscow are losing their jobs. Some people are making a choice between staying in Russia and going somewhere else temporarily or forever. So there are many changes already, but there's certainly more to come. I would posit to you that February 24, 2022 is as important a date in Russian history as was, let's say, December 25, 1991, when the Soviet flag was lowered from atop the Kremlin. So it's extremely important, and the changes have only begun streaming in. Much more to come.
And my second question was, is this, because this is kind of in my feeling, the discussion is going into that direction in European societies, as if it's Putin's war, and it's his sole decision. He is kept away from information. How would you assess the decision making? Who decided on this war, and what to expect in the next future?
Well, there's no mystery, but also no surprise. The decision to launch the operation was President Putin's. And again, no one thought it would be otherwise. There was a televised meeting of the Russian Federation Security Council on the 21st of February, which essentially featured President Putin getting acclamation, if you like, acclaim from the members of the Security Council. So they're all on the same page, and they're all following President Putin. Again, something that was only to be expected, particularly in a televised event. What is more important, however, is that since the start of the operation, public support for President Putin and for the operation itself, as well as for the armed forces, has grown. So you have a hike of maybe 10%, let's say from 67, 66 to 73, 74. Figures may vary, but they are in that range. There has been a hike in that. There's the usual effect of rallying around the flag in case of a major emergency. But also President Putin has been very eloquent and I would say persuasive to a lot of people in Russia by presenting this decision as addressing existential security problems for Russia. And he framed it not as an operation to, let's say, restore the Soviet Union or to reunify the Russian people and the Ukrainian people, whom President Putin considers as one people, but as something provoked by NATO's expansion to the east, something designed to prevent Ukraine turning into a major security threat to Russia. And a lot of people actually believe this narrative. There are those who reject it, the more liberal-minded people, the Western-leaning people, but many of these people find less and less space for them in Russia today.
Thank you. I'd like to give the word to Rinna. Rinna, what kind of role does Ukraine play in the Russian history and also political narratives? Because President Putin also kind of questioned the statehood and the independence of Ukraine in his famous speech he gave before the invasion started. What role does Ukraine play, and is it a specific role, or is this the case for all the post-Soviet states, so to say, that their independence is basically questioned by, or fundamentally questioned by, the Russian elite?
Thank you, Cengiz. My first observation about Ukrainian history is that I think that in the West, we don't have quite enough knowledge about it, right? When I became a doctor, I had to take something called comprehensive exams, and my professor interjected that I had to read, I think, 12 out of 250 books on the history of Ukraine specifically. Yet at the same time, if you go to a bookstore anywhere in Europe, I would even challenge, maybe in London, Kristina would know better, there are not that many histories of Ukraine available in the bookshelves, not at least in English language or very accessible languages. And I think that that's something that we have been thinking a lot about at the university now, that there shouldn't be histories of flyover states. This is not very well known. As a historian, though, I was trained as a historian of Russian foreign policy, yes. I tend to take it that the way that you said in your introductory remarks, that it would be difficult not to see this war as a continuation of a series of wars in Chechnya 1999, then in Georgia 2008, and now in Ukraine. I think analytically it would be difficult not to see it as a war of disintegration of the Soviet Union. What I would very quickly like to point out, though, and which is probably a view from being a professor in Finland as well, if you go to the Foreign Ministry archive, or if you talk to the Finnish ambassador who was the ambassador in Moscow in 1991, you would find from the documents that it wasn't Western powers or United States, it wasn't George Bush first, or Finnish President Koivisto, who advocated or would have somehow wanted to break apart the Soviet Union, right? This is not in the cable. They actually tend to be very concerned about nuclear threats and support Gorbachev to the end because he's in charge of nuclear weapons also and power. So those are some of the key points that I think about when I think about the Ukraine war today from a historical perspective.
Do you think it's about rebuilding, so to say, the Soviet empire? Is Ukraine? Do you fear that other post-Soviet states are equally threatened by?
It's a very difficult question. Actually, I was very happy that Professor Trenin is here today, because what I can say is that at least historians of Russian foreign relations and most of the policy experts or European political leaders, I was very much in contact with that community from December onwards, from truth movements onwards. And I don't think that I met a single person who would have predicted the February 24th to happen. The expectation was, and the understanding at least, was that President Putin and Moscow are very annoyed. There is no clarity about the future of Ukraine from their perspective. But the expectation was that Moscow really wanted to negotiate with Washington, with the United States. And it was quite logical to explain that, to expect that the process would be very long. In any negotiation, be it your trade union or international relations, you normally start with very heavy demands in the beginning. You want a long process so you can get your goals. This was the expectations. Unfortunately, we were not very good at predicting the motivations. But what I can also say is that if you look at the European map, Ukraine is in a very specific geopolitical position. It's not only in the Black Sea, but whether you think about Russian expansion or movement to the east or west, it's in the middle of it, on its way to Berlin or to Paris. And I think that this geopolitical location is actually quite specific also.
Thank you, Rinna. Elias, you've been observing Russian foreign policy for quite a long time. Were you surprised? Is this a major strategic shift, or was it actually, in hindsight, of course, somehow observable? What would you say?
Thank you for the question, Cengiz. Well, hindsight is 2020, right? So no, I would say that despite all the predictions, because this time the U.S. intelligence agency seemed to have had very, very good information, and they had predicted, I think, from early December onwards that there was a high risk of a full-scale attack on Ukraine. Nevertheless, I have to say I was also quite surprised when it then actually happened. So I think there is an element of surprise here, and I think, as you alluded to in your opening remarks, my view is that this has something to do with Mr. Putin and his close elites, that they have certainly very much, I think, miscalculated or misjudged the situation, the political and societal situation in Ukraine, because I actually thought that they would get away with a short war, 84 hours, 72 hours, so that they could capture Kiev, put in place some sort of puppet regime, and then, have a pro-Russian government in Kiev. That, of course, did not work at all. So I think there is an element here of miscalculation.
But I think probably most of the observers thought that it's about building up kind of the pressure on Ukraine without really attacking it militarily, because after all, Ukraine is not such a small state. It's about 40 million people, and has meanwhile also kind of strengthened its army, obviously, as they're showing quite a lot of resistance. But why? You said miscalculation, but still there's the question, why now? Why has the Russian government and President Putin, why have they decided to do it now? This is kind of mysterious to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is sort of the $64,000 question. But if I may, I sort of just reverse the question, so go one step back and say, because I think in general there's a broad agreement, and Dmitri will know much more about it, but I think there's a general agreement in the Russian political national security establishment that Ukraine plays a central role for Russia, both for historical reasons and for strategic reasons. And the historical reasons are, of course, that Ukraine plays a very important role in Russia's, let's say, national identity narrative, right? All nations, all countries have this narrative where they come from and what their origins are. And in the Russian narrative, it's the Kievan Rus is the cradle or the birthplace of the Russian nation. So for these historical identity reasons, I think large parts of the Russian elite have had a hard time to let Ukraine go. So that is one part of the story. The other part of the story, I think, has a lot to do with geopolitics, with geostrategy. Because if you look at the map, if we had a map here behind me, I have a map. So you would see that that Ukraine and Russia have a long border in common. I think more than 2,000 kilometers. You could also see that the Ukrainian border is, I think, approximately 500 kilometers away from Moscow. So I think actually that any government in Moscow in its right mind would like to have some form of control over the foreign and security policy orientation of Kiev, right? So I think there are these structural drivers that made it very likely, or that sort of compelled or pushed the Russian elite to maintain some form of control over Ukraine. And I think large parts of the Russian national security establishment, they were not terribly happy that Ukraine was drifting more and more towards the West. So I think that any Russian government really would have taken some steps to exert some sort of economic pressure, soft power pressure, and most likely also some form of military pressure. Why then, on the 24th of February, to launch a large-scale attack, a large-scale invasion? I think, as I remarked earlier, this has something to do with, most likely, I think, with Putin's mindset, that he genuinely believed that large parts of the Ukrainian population would quietly support the Russians, that the Zelensky government would flee to the US, and that he could sort of install a pro-Russian government there in, 84 or 72 hours. So I think there's a combination of these structural factors and then more of these agency factors, to use political science language, that can explain why and how this war broke out. That would be my analysis.
Thank you, Elias. Wolfgang, I think there is, of course, we mainly try to analyze generally in general debates, not only here, what Russia's motivations are. Is it President Putin or a larger set of persons who are supporting this? And was it a miscalculation or not? And this and that. But maybe we could briefly also touch upon the Ukrainian side. Do you think this war was somehow avoidable if the Ukrainian leadership would have maneuvered in a different way? Was there any way to avoid this, or did this push for NATO membership and EU membership actually accelerate this process? And then I would also have a second question: what are the implementations for other parts in Europe and in Russia's immediate neighborhood?
Well, Jengis, I must say that the war could have been avoided, but it was definitely in Moscow's hands, in Putin's hands to avoid the war. However, there are, of course, now, and hindsight, as was already pointed out by Elias, of course, hindsight is always 2020. I think I'm very, very self-critical when it comes to judging the situation, the deterioration of relations between Europe on the one hand and Russia on the other hand. Of course, now there's war, so therefore the only priority has to be to stop the war and to see how to move back to the negotiating table. Negotiations, maybe also concerns, were not really being have not really been taken seriously by the West, and clearly also not by Ukraine. Clearly, yeah. When we think of the two agreements, which were very much to the detriment of Ukraine, in my opinion, but nevertheless, it was never, both sides, neither Kiev nor Moscow were really interested in implementing these two agreements. There, a lot of time has been lost, and because it was not really taken seriously, the threat of military intervention, much time was lost really to approach this obviously serious issue from a diplomatic and political side. That's a problem. But I'm also I was also fascinated by the fact that you referred to the 24th of February to be a turning point. It might be, it might not be, and Dmitri has already pointed out maybe there was another turning point. Incidentally, in 2018, late 2018, I published a book on turning points but at the time, and this is the subtitle to this, was the digital authoritarian 21st century, so to speak. So I see the turning point someplace else. But I refer to turning points in Chinese history, Deng Xiaoping maybe, or we can go on. And of course, I also elaborated at length on the Putin speech in Munich in 2007. I think this is in many ways a turning point which was overlooked basically by the West, not taken seriously, obviously. So here you could see how step by step, then of course later on 2014, Crimea and all these issues, Syria in many ways is also some sort of a turning point in Russia's foreign policy, the force projection, and all these issues. So we could probably discuss with no end the issue, is this a turning point or not? Of course, it needs to be taken seriously. Another turning point, the pandemic, of course, is also something which is now not really being addressed. Clearly, the reason being the war in Ukraine. Now, what is very interesting for me is how the argument for this war shifted over time. For the longest time in preparation, it was NATO basically. And I still remember when I was in Harvard as the Schumpeter professor, and my point there was, this was in 2013-14. So when I said, well, I mean, just imagine Mexico City or Mexico decides, now our main partner, strategic partner, is not any longer Washington, it is Beijing, for example, or Moscow. How would Washington react to this? So that is another illustration how in the past many opportunities were lost, not taken seriously, not taken up in order to find a solution. Now here we are in the middle of something which now has shifted actually in the argument from, or the reasoning from Moscow, from Putin in particular, from what a threat to an identity issue. Yeah, all of a sudden, and here the Yugoslav parallel comes in for me, all of a sudden it is actually Ukrainians are actually Russians. Yeah, and I really very much admired the Gorbachev for the fact that he did not in the late 1990s, early 1991, pull out the Rus issue, the historic roots, so to speak, of Russia and Ukraine, as Milosevic did in Kosovo. Here you can see how the power of history, the power of words, play a decisive role in creating a situation which is now being fought out in the battlefield, and Ukraine obviously is the victim in all of this. And then for me also an interesting issue and this is the resistance on the part of Ukraine. Maybe Putin saw how the puppet government in Kabul in middle of August fled immediately. The president went off immediately with the cash, whatever he had. And the Ukrainian president did not just simply vanish. Yeah. For us Austrians, this is a very important historic example, because when when Hitler marched into Austria, we immediately gave up. Clearly, there were different reasons attached to this. It's a matter, but resistance as such is obviously now forging a nation, a Ukrainian nation. That is for sure. What is not for sure is the borders of this new Ukraine, so to speak. I know I have gone a bit astray.
No, thank you for pointing this out.
To bring me back on the right.
No, thank you for pointing this out. But you also mentioned some of the keywords I wanted to ask you too, and that's the Balkans. This is, and particularly Serbia, for instance, where we've seen support rallies in support of Russia and President Putin in particular. And this is also an area, a region where the European Union's interests of enlargement and transformation through enlargement have clashed over the last years increasingly with the Russian, but also other international actors' influence. Do you see any threats for the destabilization of the Balkans, and also is this the end of the European enlargement process there, if we are facing a kind of new Cold War in the next future?
Well, contrary to some of my colleagues, experts, and friends, I see in this war, if you can see something positive, it is probably playing out in the Balkans. Inasmuch as we will see a much clearer situation now that the Western Balkans countries have to address. And there clearly it is about Serbia as the centerpiece, so to speak, because Serbia, as still the largest, the most populous country in the post-Yugoslav region, is connected with both still unresolved issues of the Yugoslav implosion, and that is clearly Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo. In the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Russia does not really play a role which is decisive. Again, here I'm sure others would point to presidency member Mr. Dodik, who is Putin's underling there. Yes, it's true, but over the past couple of weeks since the war broke out, you could see how Mr. Dodik is now being extremely careful not to speak out too much. And he was the first, by the way, to call Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov And there was a big thing about it in Serbia and in Bosnia, because Mr. Lavrov obviously told Mr. Dodik to return to the state institutions there. So you can see here, Bosnia is not the big issue when it comes to the confrontation between Ukraine and Russia. On the other hand, I think it is an additional impetus for the European Union to finally try and get its act together in the Western Balkans. I think this would really push forward a much stronger and a much more united policy in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in extension in all of the Western Balkans. Now, Kosovo, on the other hand, there Russia has a decisive support which it provides for Belgrade, because Kosovo will only enter the United Nations if Russia says so. Therefore, I don't believe that, and this is really maybe a collateral damage for the Kosovo issue. Kosovo, in my opinion, as long as the tensions between Moscow and the rest of Europe and the United States is such as it is, and will probably be for a long time, I don't see a chance for Kosovo to enter the United Nations. But I think it opened up the door for NATO membership, and whether this is something that Mr. Putin intends or Mr. Vučić, I doubt it. So in many ways, you can see certain opportunities, but they have to be seized by Brussels. There has to really be a fundamental change also of the accession policy, so to speak, and I have been promoting for quite some time this kind of accession in stages, instead of waiting till the very end until all the 35 chapters are being negotiated, have been closed, and only then the accession process can start. In my opinion, it would be much better to go step by step, and in particular integrate it economically into the European into the European free market. And there, in my opinion, it could be the European Union could start out by devising a pan-European energy policy, because this will be necessary for the European Union anyhow. But one should really include in this the Western Balkans, whoever wants to be part of it. And as you know, in the electricity grid issue now, Ukraine is already becoming part of it. So I think there are opportunities to really come to a new approach of enlargement. That, in my opinion, should now really be the opportunity that needs to be now taken up by the European Union.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Kristina, we've already kind of started talking, and that was the idea, to start with the war and the effects on Russia and Ukraine. And now, so what does it mean for the regions beyond the affected two countries? What would you say? Would you agree with Wolfgang that the war has kind of reinforced European identity? What about Germany's changes, for instance, in its defense military policy? And do you see other regions than the Balkans also affected by this war, like the Nordic region or the Baltics? How would you assess these questions?
Yeah, thank you, Cengiz. We have heard quite a lot about these various things. And I think perhaps one sort of headline in the first instance, that of course, we talked about this as Putin's war turns out against the Ukraine, but of course, it's also Putin's war to challenge the European post-war order, the order that emerged in the context of German unification, and then of course developed further after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when sort of cooperative engagement on all sides had to be reconsidered and then built around, the various principles, in particular in the European case of course, on the basis of the Helsinki Final Act and then the OSCE that emerged from the CSCE, never mind the UN Charter and of course Budapest Memorandum and so forth. And I can talk about that a little bit more. But of course, at the heart of the matter, what we heard in the German case was that speech by Olaf Scholz 4 days after the start of the war, that for Germany, this now meant a sort of Zeitenwende, another turning point, really major turning point in history. That is sort of a generic term per se, but it plays a little bit on what I called Wendezeit in my book, but what related to that East German term, of course, die Wende, the turn as part of these revolutions of 1989, as one moved into this sort of principles, norms-based world with political and economic liberalization. And I think what was very interesting is that, it took almost like, this a social democratic chancellor, a bit akin to 1999, when there was the Kosovo War and the red-green government had to make, the tough decision, would they, having had constitutional changes under the Helmut Kohl government, whether Germany could ever act inside NATO, out of area with UN mandates, then to prevent genocide in the Balkans, in 1999 be part of this bombing of Serbia under NATO auspices. And now again, it's actually, and that's where I think sort of miscalculations on the Russian side come in, a few days after Merkel left, then we get this, for another round of amassing of troops, demands of security guarantees from NATO, but especially the United States. And that actually wrapped up not just the small countries in the Europe in between, as one spoke about in the past, the countries in between Germany and Russia, if you look at it geographically, but also Germany itself, that somehow over the head of the Europeans, there ought to be given particular guarantees, which effectively entailed a thinning out of US presence on the continent. All these demands on, that America had to pull out its nuclear weapons that are stationed in Western Europe, but go back to the positions of NATO to 1997, and of course guarantees that there would be no further NATO enlargement. All of which, of course, is built on this narrative that Dmitri rightly presented, that has been actually ever since Yeltsin 1993 going on about, that somehow there was this betrayal of the Soviet Union and then Russia, that there were clear delimitations that NATO would never enlarge eastward somehow as part of the German unification talks. And of course, we have all these documents available on all sides, and we know that none such promises were made, and that, of course, there were lots of talks going on where one tested all sorts of ideas, French ideas of a European confederation, Gorbachev's common European home, ideas about, what does it mean when we talk about NATO jurisdiction? But then it ended all up in the 2+4 treaty as regards to Germany, that there were these special provisions and curtailments as regards that East German terrain. And of course, later, as we moved in the 1990s, and as, we had also instability and chaos politically, economically, in all sorts of ways in Russia, the countries, the former satellite states and the Balts, and also some of the other ex-Soviet republics turned westwards for security guarantees. And of course, initially they all wanted to join the EU to be part of that club, that institutional West with, prosperity and security and stability. But it turned out that that would be a long process to satisfy the criteria of the acquis communautaire, because of course the European community had turned European Union. It was a much more integrated, more difficult club to join. And that's why, of course, in the first round, we saw Austria, Sweden, and Finland. They were already, of course, fully functioning, always had been liberal democracies of a very high social standard. It was more a political question when the time was to join. So they were front of the queue. And the others just had to wait till 2004. And in this context of instability, and we have not to forget the Chechen wars, the wars, Armenia, Azerbaijan, a lot of uncertainty, and the implosion of Yugoslavia with the refugee flows, all of this turmoil on the continent. So they did look actually first to NATO, and that put enormous pressure on NATO, because after all, the Americans wanted the peace dividend. They had withdrawn troops from Germany. They had used them, of course, in the first Gulf War, which was, a UN mission where also the Soviet Union had accepted. But the point what I'm trying to make is that America was inward looking, and certainly under Clinton, with its emphasis, its economy stupid, there was no interest, of an American or somehow NATO internal driven NATO expansionism. But that's precisely the sort of narrative that Putin has been peddling. That somehow the Americans have been on this big expansionist drive, and the agency of the intermediate and smaller countries has been completely written out. And if you now look at the historical record of all these documents that have been made available, you see, however, how much pressure there was precisely from Central and Eastern Europe and the Baltic states to get security guarantees from the West. They had the choice to choose from the East or from the West, but they chose to go to NATO. They didn't knock on Russia's door. And we must also not forget that, of course, the narrative of the near abroad already emerges with Zhirinovsky in 1993. Those elections at the end of 1993 were really important to sort of see how the ultranationalist wing was beginning to emerge in Russia, understandably so, getting stronger through this withdrawal of the Red Army. But in this context, I would also like to highlight that German position, because, of course, in view of looking for some kind of cooperative integrative structures, of course, Germany gave a lot of money to the Soviet Union and then to Russia. And in terms of, we're talking here about 100 billion Deutschmarks just over a 4-year period, never mind more aid given through World Bank, IMF, European Community, European Union, well into the late 1990s, also from Kohl's perspective, to support Yeltsin in his election campaigns. And maybe it was wrong to put the money in the basket of one man when we consider that law and order didn't take hold. And yet that was perceived as the best bet to somehow stay in dialogue, to somehow offer integrative structures through inviting to the G7, through the NATO founding act with Russia, and so forth. So I just want to remind you of the significance of these efforts between cooperation and, of course, also reinsurance on the part of one of the major European powers. So it wasn't just all America. Actually, Germany played quite a key role. In fact, it was almost like a sort of triangle, Russia, America, and Germany in the 90s. And so we don't have to be surprised, considering that of course, Germany continued also bilaterally as part of that reconciliation, but also out of national interest, economic, policies that have been there since, Helmut Schmidt, since Willy Brandt, gas pipeline projects. Those ties have been there, and it was a big step for a social democratic chancellor who has to straddle in his party, taking a more Willy Brandt line or a more Helmut Schmidt line, if you remember the NATO dual track decision and Schmidt's relations with Brezhnev, and so forth, this question of how much dialogue and how much deterrence, to then really go as a chancellor also against a big chunk of your party and say, no, actually, we stand together in the EU with the sanction regime, and we will not have Nord Stream 2. And that was, one could say Scholz was very slow. It was very, very reactive. But when the reaction came, it was also very forceful and very strong, and it pointed to a new kind of positioning also for Germany as in terms of leadership inside the EU. And I would like to make one other historical point, picking up from what has been said before about, this question of, why did Gorbachev allow the Soviet Union to fall apart as it did? I mean, we have to remember that, of course, this parade of sovereignties had started in 1990, and actually it was Yeltsin in some ways who challenged with the declaration of Russian sovereignty, that Soviet entity. But in some ways, because Gorbachev held on to Lenin, he wanted to reform the Soviet Union also under the sort of Leninist auspices. One important thing was self-determination. And so when the Balts wanted the re-establishment of independence, after all, they didn't secede, they wanted to re-establish something that had been taken away through the annexation after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. For the other Soviet socialist republics, they would go, of course, with that sort of Leninist self-determination, which in part, the way Gorbachev behaved and going with those rules, if you so want, allowed. And it's actually Putin who has said that, this was a mistake by Lenin to grant, these peoples inside the Russian Empire, this self-determination, and then they chose independence. And so in that sense, 1917 is also in part to blame for where we are today. So actually we have two historical focal points, 1917 and 1991, we have to bear in mind. And it is very interesting to look at that narrative that he has constructed in the Millennium Manifesto, first of all, 1999-2000, on the turn of the year when he first became president. Then, saying in 2005, greatest geopolitical catastrophe, the collapse of the Soviet Union. You see, it's not a World War I or World War II, it's the collapse of that empire. Then the Munich speech. And I do think people took it seriously. He criticized unipolarity. He really had a big rant of how he talked about suddenly NATO in a way that he hadn't said in 2004 when the Balts had joined, amongst others. But then, of course, there was that little twisting and changing of jobs between Putin and Medvedev. So for 4 years, that issue sort of went away. And then suddenly Putin reappeared, and the focus was much more on actually the foreign policy and the actions that were taken. And then in the first 8 years, where there was a lot of consolidation of power in the country, and in that sense, more a sort of domestic focus economically and politically. And the foreign policy really came to play ever since he returned to power. So we have to, when we think of these sort of longer term developments and we look at the speeches and the actions taken, we see the sort of ratcheting up over time, ever since he came back, especially in 2012. And maybe, some have argued it was because the West looked perhaps too leniently on what happened in 2014, that he felt emboldened that when he felt the time was right, it was time to challenge and to take what he thought and thinks should be his.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Before I let me also address to the audience, please, if you have questions, comments, write them into the chat. We will try to address these as well. But before going into the Q&A, I would like to try a second round with a few questions, and to make sure that participants or the audience can also pose questions and we can respond to them. I would kindly ask all of you to keep your answers a bit short. I know the questions are big and it's difficult to to answer, to give short answers. But let me start with you, Kristina, in the second round. In reference to your book, After the Wall, my question is, what's different now? Or would you say, are we going back to a new Cold War? Because I can't remember ever since the end of the Cold War, any such situation as today, where there is a kind of the ambition to cut off Russia, links with Russia, any communication with Russia, economic ties with Russia. So this reminds me of the Cold War. Is this comparable with the situation of the Cold War, or is it entirely different?
No, I think we're looking at something different. I think you must remember that the Cold War was something that sort of encompassed, it was a world order where we were sort of frozen in these two blocks. And of course, we hovered between more containment, more détente, more tensions, less tensions. But it was also, fundamentally about an ideological antagonism with different kind of completely different developmental models being played out, modernization models, if you so wish, which was overlaying. Plus that, of course, you had these two superpowers who, in terms of their nuclear weaponry, also, had mutual assured destruction. And of course, the world looks completely different today with more nuclear powers around and different power differentials. I think something else that does actually play a role, if we were to say and consider that, of course, Lavrov in 2019 said that Russia wanted to press for a post-West world order, by which he really meant, challenging this sort of unipolarity, but also, perhaps this sort of what some have called in political science, the rules-based order, this sort of what has been sort of enshrined, especially after 91, but of course can be tied back to sort of post-45. And of course, the Chinese have said they would like to be a world ordering power by 2050. And together, both of them challenge the United States to recognize that we are in some kind of multipolar world. And I think we just have to realize that indeed, if you also think, about how the European Union stands together, that yes, we are to a certain extent, of course, we are in a multipolar world. I don't think we need to question that. But I think where we are different, say, to the 19th century, where it was really about, if diplomacy doesn't work, we will apply not the tool of diplomacy, because if we want to press for what we really want, we are willing to use war. In other words, peace at any cost is gone. And of course, fear of nuclear Armageddon, phenomenon that sort of was, you know, the big stopper of war in the Cold War is gone, because we have now seen by a big power, we have not seen just, you know, Iraq invading Kuwait in 1990 and then, you know, having a UN sanctions applied and UN mandate to apply force to push Iraq out. And then we have had, of course, also the flawed, you know, American-driven regime change policies. But if you think about invasion warfare, you know, Iraq invading Kuwait is simply not the same as when one permanent member of the UN Security Council invades its neighboring country. And we have seen that the UN doesn't work when one of its members actually is the aggressor. The whole system is completely flawed. And yet, of course, what is at stake it's not just that, you know, in some ways Putin is challenging the order in Europe and wants actually America out, and in that sense picks up from where Yeltsin had said, you know, why don't you go out and leave Europe to us, and we deal with Europe and we give all the security. No, what we are seeing really is also a challenge to those norms and the principles. And that is, of course, what the West is standing up to defend. And that is, of course, something that's different from the 19th century, say, where it's just about power politics in the classic sense. That we have tried to live together for all our differences in national interests, to engage and apply diplomatic tools to somehow deal with it or find fora. I mean, you know, we have the OSCE, we have the United, we have so many fora where we should be able to talk, and yet that's completely failed. And I think we have to now reconsider, how do we tackle and how do we find an exit from the war, because ultimately there will be some kind of exit. How do we find ways and what does that actually mean for these principle-based fora that we would refer to, you know, sovereignty of countries, inviolability of borders, all these things that are enshrined, because somehow, especially the UN, looks completely undermined.
Thank you. Rinna, my question to you would be, do you see, is this the end of the liberal world order and the end of multilateralism? How can multilateralism function or work under these circumstances?
Thank you, Cengiz. Well, we also have a question in the chat about how to proceed. Is there ever going to be a kind of a truth and reconciliation order after so much trauma? Inside the UN already now, there are discussions. The international bodies such as the EU, the UN, I think they actually started approaching questions very, very quickly this time around. So a little bit like in history, we sometimes built train tracks before there was a train that could travel in the Alps. I think the United Nations, for example, is looking for diplomats, not as a peace negotiator, but a key point persons who they could be already now, which is a very proactive measure. At the same time, it's difficult to assess anything during a war, especially this war that's turned already quite brutal towards civilian populations. And we could ask Dr. Trenin also about that. It's my assessment that Moscow will not be very interested in engaging with the OSCE, for example, in the future. That has been one of the key historical institutions, and Kristina's book also illuminates these questions very well. We think about Kristina's book a lot these days. Mm-hmm. But the UN could be somehow a possible format also, because Russia is in it. The international order is in flux, and some of the questions to ask would be, who are going to be the hegemonic powers then in the future? Is it going to be United States and China? What is going to be Russia's relationship to those powers? Russia is not going to stop existing, but we don't know what is going to happen yet. And something that I think about, I researched Africa very much, and I have been a researcher like Dr. Trenin of Soviet Union in the Middle East. As I see Africa, for example, currently, China is on the ground, Russia is on the ground, but the countries are quite divided. The three countries where we find Russian influence are not the same ones as China. And I don't know what all of this is going to look like in the future, but it's in flux. One final point, though, to answer to this, since we do think about international organizations in terms of war and peace, I think it's very difficult today to look at the war in Ukraine. The amount of civilian casualties is tremendous. I'm not a historian of the Finnish Winter War, but I think in this brutal war, we had maybe 1,000 civilian casualties. Ukraine has a large population, but the civilian casualties are very heavy at this very moment today, yesterday, the end of last week. I fear that Russia's strategic imperative is to have very high civilian casualties first, and then the de-escalation is to what you would call a normal warfare. So the new normal warfare could be war. And for all my hopefulness, for all my intellectual capacity and my background as a historian of international institutions, that's also a fact on the ground as we speak, and something that I cannot, for example, discount.
Thank you so much, Rinna. Elias, I would like to pass over to you. You've already responded to some of the comments in the chat that you don't think that kicking out Russia from any of these multilateral institutions would be a wise move because it would close all channels for negotiation. Do you think that these channels still, that multilateral organizations still have a role to play in this context right now? Do they have the capacity and the authority to play any positive role?
Well, I guess the answer depends very much on what kind of expectations do you have for international organizations and institutions. If you have the expectations that international institutions and organizations like the UN are going to play the role of some kind of night watchman or international police force, I think then obviously these organizations do not work. But as far as I remember, my view would be that these organizations had never the ambition to be some sort of night watchman. I think it was after the experience with the League of Nations, it was pretty clear that you had to give the great powers of the day a special role, a special prerogative. Otherwise, why would they join this club and bind themselves, right? So I think the fact that we have the UN Security Council, where the big powers have a veto, has very much to do with the power structure after the end of the Second World War, and it has to do with the experience from the League of Nations. So I think I totally agree that the UN is probably malfunctioning in many, many ways, but in the end of the day, I think it's the best we have, and we have to work with that. And I think in a very basic sense, it's important to have the UN and the UN Security Council because it provides a platform for negotiations and talks, right? And I think from my perspective, talking is always better than not talking, because, you know, if you have a serious conflict, you know, you can talk to the other party and try to resolve the matter. It does not always work out, and clearly in the Ukraine conflict, it does seem not to be the case at the moment, at least. But at least you can, you know, you can give it a chance, you can give it a try, right? So I think it's very important to have these international institutions, even though they play a very minor role. And on a second and related note, I think it's also important to have these institutions because in a way they can reduce the risk of misunderstandings or miscalculations between the big powers, right? So I think some people make the argument that the conflict like the First World War was at least partly occurred because there was a misunderstanding between the great powers. We had no functioning institutions at that point in time. Because when policymakers talk to each other, they exchange information, right? And thereby they reduce the level of or the risk of misunderstandings. So I think I totally agree with many of my co-panelists that the international institutions, multilateral setups and organizations do not seem to work perfectly or not at all in the current crisis. I still do think that they play in general a very, very important role in the world order, and perhaps even an increasingly more important role as we move towards a more and more a world order that is, let's say, characterized more and more by multipolarity, i.e. many different regional and global power centers. So I would still make a case for international institutions.
Yeah, and maybe even this crisis or this war kind of re-emphasizes the importance of these institutions in also solving post-conflict situations, not only during the conflict itself, but afterwards. Elias, another question which is very much in my mind is, did, in your opinion, Russia and President Putin overestimate Russia's strength and influence, and kind of underestimate President Biden in the US and also the West? What would you say? Is that did that also play a role?
Well, I can only speculate what Mr. Putin was thinking, right? But I guess you can make a good case that the West appeared to be rather weak at this point in time. You had the withdrawal, the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? You had President Biden, who has enormous domestic problems. It was also mentioned that Angela Merkel was, after 16 years in power, she was replaced by Mr. Scholz. So there was perhaps a power vacuum in Europe, or let's say not a power vacuum, or a leadership vacuum. So I think you can make or tell a plausible story that the Russians had reasons to believe that the West was sort of inward looking and more sort of navel gaze, had not the capacity, the intellectual or military capacity to deal with external problems and challenges. So I think that was part of the miscalculation. I think the bigger miscalculation was probably the military balance of power on the ground. And I think Mr. Putin is here not alone, because I work here at the military college in Denmark. And I can tell you, many of my military colleagues, they have told us over the last 10 or 5 years that the Russian military is 200 meters tall, and they are so capable. They have all these new technological things. They have these very refined strategies and tactics and hybrid war and what have you, right? If you look at the first 3 weeks of the war, and now many of my colleagues here have to revisit their assumptions about the capabilities of the Russian military forces. It seems to be extremely poor plans. They have logistical problems. They appear to make tactical mistakes. It's still a mystery why the Russian Air Force has not established air control, or let's say air superiority over the Ukrainian airspace. The Russians, as far as we can tell, they do not conduct sort of joint operations where the Air Force and the ground forces closely coordinate their activities. Most likely because the Russians do not have the capacity to carry out these rather complex operations. So I think that, again, I think it's plausible to assume that the Russians have misjudged the balance of power on the ground, the military balance of power, because frankly, many Western observers have also misjudged the balance of power. So I think there are two types of misjudgment here, both, I think, vis-a-vis the West, but more importantly, the military balance of power.
Thank you so much, Elias. Dmitri, if I may turn to you. What do you think, how we will, as a world, get out of this situation? What do you see in the next future, and how do you see Russia's role in the near future?
Well, Cengiz, I think that we live in a world in which there are no norms and no principles anymore. I think we passed the line from confrontation that started in 2014 to a war, a different kind of war than the Cold War. Call it whatever you want, hybrid war or something else, but it's going to be war. Russia is very angry. And Russia is turned anti-Western for the first time, I would say. Not anti-capitalist, not anti this or that country, but anti-Western as such. It's not, Putin made the decision, but the decision is backed by the vast majority of the elite and the bulk of the Russian people. And I don't think it will change. The kind of treatment that has been meted out for Russia makes a lot of Russians hate those people who've resorted to these measures. We talk about poor planning. It was very naive, it now looks in hindsight, that the central bank still thought that somehow the dollars that they had was money. Dollars, if you're America's enemy, anything that you have is not money. It will disappear. You would remember from Bulgakov's novel, The Master and Margarita, all these banknotes are turning into just pieces of paper. This is what's happening. All those people who thought of the West as a safe haven now should know better. It is not. Your property can be confiscated without any charges, without anything at all, not by a court of law, but by an executive decision. So we are in a situation in which we've never been. I think it's not just revision of the policies of Gorbachev. It's the revision of the policies of Peter the Great. That's what's happening. It's a major tectonic shift that's happening in Russia, whatever the outcome of the Ukraine war. And we'll talk about that. I don't think it's time for, unfortunately, it's time for dialogue or discussion. We just don't fit. The narrative that exists in the West does not fit with the narrative that exists in Russia. There's nothing to talk about anymore. The international institutions are all Western dominated. The most recent one was the Chess Federation. Before that, the Soccer Federation. Before that, the Cat Lovers Association. Anything, you get kicked out of everywhere. But you're not kicked out of life. You still continue to exist. But this as I said, this makes a huge difference. One lesson that perhaps we should have learned before is this. I'm not talking about who promised what, and to me this is not that important. It's who promised not to enlarge or who understood what. I think that the West never tells you a lie, but the West is usually hypocritical. That's the Western attitude. The Russian attitude is to be cynical about things. So hypocrisy versus cynicism, that's where we meet, and we don't fit, really. So my lesson from history is this. When after a major war, and the Cold War was a major war, the peace settlement that you reach is not acceptable to the party that's designated as the defeated party. And that party is strong enough to recover, even partially recover. Then in a generation's time, you have it all over again. Of course, there are examples in history when the defeated power, like Germany after, at least Western Germany after the Second World War, or Napoleonic France, were promptly invited into the world order that they accepted. Then you had a different story. But when a nation is left out and feels left out and feels threatened by the fact that the world order is dominated by somebody else, like the post-Cold War security order in Europe, let's face it, was dominated by the United States and managed through NATO. That's a reality. And Russia was an outlier. And Russia, again, for the reasons we may all discuss, and maybe people will condemn them, but Russia did not accept that. Whether it was Putin or somebody else, doesn't matter. Anyone could have, I think Elias said something very important. No Russian leader, even the most liberal one, even Navalny, if you ever imagined Navalny as the leader of Russia, would not allow an American proxy to reach within 500 kilometers of Moscow with weapons and alliances and all that. So it's just, it was a collision waiting to happen. Of course, this is what's going on in Europe is not the first war in Europe. You mentioned Yugoslavia '99 lasted for 78 days. It was There was bombing of Belgrade, the kind of, we've not seen yet in Ukraine. No overland operation, that's for sure. But certainly that war did not change the European order the way that this one is changing. So basically, I've been talking far too long. I would say this. It is, as I said, it's probably not the time to waste too much energy in discussing and talking past each other. It's a time for action. If what happens in Ukraine will be a major feature of the future, of what kind of situation you will have in Europe, or we will have in Europe. But talking about that simply does not make any sense to me. Cengiz, what was your question? Actually, I'm sorry.
Thank you for elaborating.
Thank
you for elaborating on these important questions and highlighting that Russia is angry. And but and you also touched upon it, is where do you see Russia's future role? Is China potentially a new ally with which Russia will cooperate more closely, or do you see any other actors? I'd be interested in where do you see, because it seems to be really an important turning point also for Russia's self-positioning.
Absolutely. Russia lost balance. I imagine that Russia would still be, even last year, I imagine that Russia would be able to balance among the various centers of power, some sort of equilibrium, though not equidistance, between the superpowers, China and the United States, some sort of a relationship with Europe and, China, India, balancing everywhere and getting the best of what could be gotten. Now, this is all passé. This is all water under the bridge. In today's world, Russia does not have allies. It has a major power, China, which shares an important interest with Russia, and for which Russia's weakening, whether as a result of external pressure, of an internal turmoil, is a major threat. And China will be interested in propping up Russia against the United States up to a point, clearly. They do care about economic relations with you guys. They do care about their remaining economic relations with the United States. They're very pragmatic, very smart, and all that. And certainly they will ask for a price when they engage with Russia. And I'm sure Russia will have to give them much of what they want. For years, we've been talking about the so-called choice made by Alexander Nevsky, say the Russian prince of the 13th century, who was confronted, as Russia was, simultaneously by the German Teutonic Knights in the west and by the Mongol hordes in the east. And he chose to submit to the Great Khan and fight against the Germans and the Swedes. His reason was and remains very, very, very relevant today. The Chinese and the Mongols and other Asians, they essentially need from you some material things. China historically is known as a tributor, as a country that has relations of tribute with its neighbors, tributary states that defer to the emperor, that bring some goods to the emperor and all that. The West is different. The West is not only after your material things, I'm talking about the argument, but it's also after your soul. The West is universalist by definition. They want to turn others into some sort of acolytes of the West, some sort of pro-Western, not really Western. You cannot turn even a Ukrainian into a Westerner. It's difficult to turn a Bulgarian or the people in the Balkans. You can never turn them into real Westerners. As national groups, you can turn certain individuals who can be fully assimilated, but not the communities of people. They will always remain pro-Western. They will always be leaning on the West, looking up to the West, but they will not be Western. Similar fate was essentially designated for Russia. Russians, and I think that's very important for all of us to remember, there's something in their DNA that they do not recognize anyone above them. That's their problem. But it's also something that keeps them going. They simply did not. You can, rationally, I could explain, and I've been writing about that, that one shouldn't fear NATO's enlargement, expansion all the way to the Russian border. One shouldn't fear too much American missiles, 1,000 kilometers from Moscow. You just place similar missiles on Russian submarines and let them patrol the eastern seaboard of the United States, or raise the alert level of your strategic nuclear force, or adopt the first strike deterrent strategy. There are many ways of dealing with all that. But there's something that rests deep inside the Russian elite that makes them behave differently from this more rational view that I've just explained. The trauma of June 22, 1941, the German invasion, the German attack of the Soviet Union, will be there forever. And that's why Ukraine matters. That's why Belarus matters. And again, I can spend a lot of time talking about the differences, technological, military differences, strategic between today and 1941. But that's to no avail. It's there. And you have to, either you accept it, recognize it, or you think it's just, an old guy, unreformed, former KGB, whatever. He may be a cuckoo for all we know. That kind of thing, that Western narrative, I think, poorly prepares the West for what's to come, actually for what has come. Because Putin crossed his Rubicon today, meaning on the 24th of February. I expected him to act differently. I expected him to pressure. I expected him to threaten. I expected him to draw concessions from the West, which he was doing. But at some point he decided, no, that's not enough. I'm only prolonging the torture of Russia's strategic position. And I have to somehow solve that Ukrainian issue. You're not talking about the kind of regime that exists in Ukraine. It's, on the one hand, it's a regime that rhetorically strives to be part of Europe. On the other hand, the most active, the most energetic part of the regime are the descendants of far-right people who joined with the Nazis against the Soviet Union, and before that, who were pretty hard on the Poles, very visceral. I would call those guys the most anti-Russian group anywhere. And when those two streaks, very different streaks, came to power, the first thing that they did was to repeal the law on the Russian language. Just imagine it in a country where half the population has Russian as their native language or more. And when you see the war today on your television screens, there are people who speak Russian on both sides. You have prisoners, you have anti-Russian diatribes by people who speak as good Russian as I do. There's an element of a civil war. There's an element of, it goes very, very deep. And simply talking about Ukraine and Russia as two neighboring countries that have a conflict, and of course, Russia with its expansionism, historical, what have you, baggage is the aggressor, is a shorthand that does not allow you to see the story. So there are many problems here. I don't know how they will be resolved. I think that Russia will be leaning more and more on China. I think Russia will be also in league with countries such as Iran and many others. And do not treat lightly the fact that many of the Russians who are now being killed, Russian soldiers in Ukraine, are killed by American or other NATO countries' weapons. And this is something that will not be forgotten. One of the worst things, perhaps, for Europe that happened in a piecemeal fashion over the last decade is the disappearance of historical reconciliation between Russia and Germany. That has far-reaching implications. Germany is now seen as second in command after the United States. And just like in my own youth, when I was studying at a military college, I had the privilege of being given 2 languages to study, both of our principal and second in command enemies of the time, English and German. We're going back to that.
Thank you so much, Dmitri. Also for pointing out that what I get from what you're saying is these totally different narratives, and also that it's actually not helpful that in Western media and discussions, it's all about Putin going cuckoo. I don't think that is very helpful if you really want to find any solutions to these to the war and its repercussions. So Wolfgang, I wanted to ask, we are already beyond our time, but I think it's fine if we and thank you, Elias, by the way, for answering already some of the questions in the chat. Wolfgang, you I wanted to ask you also with your experience as a negotiator, how do you deal with parties that have totally different narratives? Is there any, how do you address these different perceptions of the world and of what's going on and the justifications for what's going on? And do you see any chances for these talks that are currently taking place between the 2 war parties, or is there any third party needed, and who could that be?
Well, after having listened now to Mr. Trenin, to Dmitri, it reminded me of a recent YouTube that I saw with an interview in English, by the way, with Alexander Dugin. And Professor Dugin said there is a Russian truth. And this is very different from the Western whatever truth, but which does not mean that, and this Dimitris pointed out, that the Western truth in the perception of Russia is wrong. It is just different, and I think that's the point of departure for any negotiation or any dialogue or any communication that needs to be restarted. And clearly, Dimitri's extremely straightforward and very clear pessimism that this is not the time now to negotiate, is a real drawback, I would say, for me personally, because I still believe as a diplomat, even when there is a war, you must not stop trying to address and to talk to and to mediate in order to stop the war. But now when we listen to Dmitri, I think there is such a fundamental difference that exists as the background, so to speak, and maybe motivation for this war, that indeed even I am now at odds with how to answer your question. I was actually a couple of weeks ago once time into the war, I was asked, well, what would be the, so to speak, possibilities? What are your ideas to how could we start, or how could we help and assist in starting negotiations or whatever in terms of doing something which is not war, which is not fighting, which is diplomacy, which is talking to each other. And in a way, of course, I was thinking in terms of actually who still has trust. Where is there a modicum of trust still left? Because the most shocking thing for me was actually the way Mr. Putin dealt with Mr. Macron and Mr. Scholz, particularly with President Macron. I mean, that was, of course, we are now coming to what is truth and what is a lie. But basically, Mr. Putin said, well, there's not going to be a war. You don't worry about it. This is not that. So he actually really put Mr. Macron on the spot. Yeah. And there were voices around in Europe saying, well, now this is a defeat of Mr. Macron and it's bad and so on. I think this kind of thinking that when you try to talk, when you try to bridge this credibility gap or try to approach what actually is there still somewhere common ground, this needs to be taken seriously and should not be criticized. Now, we have seen the Israeli initiative, which sort of fits into my out-of-the-box thinking, which I believe is very important in this wider context. I have also addressed the institutional issue, actually, and in my opinion, and there I agree with our Danish friend, that the United Nations, where does Russia have a privileged position? Not in the OSCE, of course it does, de facto, but in the United Nations, it has an institutional privileged position. So and therefore I thought actually that that Russia could eventually return to the Security Council, to the United Nations, in spite of the General Assembly result, which was devastating for Russia, of course. But the Security Council could play a role in all of this, because there you have also China in there, and I think China does have a role to play in all of this. If China wants to become a global player, as its intention clearly is, it will have to engage in forging a new world order, which is not going to be Western any longer, which will have something else. But this, of course, means it has to engage. Yeah, and I think the Ukrainian war could be a case in point or a starting point for something which we don't know what actually will happen. But nevertheless, I think these are some of the elements which I believe need to be further investigated, and you need to go into this much deeper than I can do this now. On the other hand, you have the personal factor. Yeah. And I was writing about saying, like, for Mr. Schröder to do something positive, it's probably too late already, and maybe for Mrs. Merkel it's too early. You know, so I think between the institutional setup and the personal relations that have existed or still exist, something in between, or with these two, combining these two elements, maybe something could come out. Of course, the role of Turkey is very important. And again, I come back to Israel. I think that there are some of these elements where probably the answer, or maybe Dmitri would tell me, well, listen, well, it's nice fantasizing, but it does not fly. Could be. But I think we have the duty to do everything in order to stop the war, because we can talk about a future isolated Russia, or a Russia which will move closer to China. And there, of course, I'm asking myself, is actually Europe worse than China now from a national interest point of view of Moscow? I don't know. I mean, this is not up to me to judge. So anyhow, I think what needs to be done is we need to continue dealing with this issue, and there cannot be something like a what we call in German Misserfolg in terms of bridging this ever widening gap. We have to see this also, because there are 2 points that are very different from the situation in the 1990s when another war happened in Europe, in Yugoslavia. Of course, in Yugoslavia there was no nuclear power involved. I mean, this is an added responsibility on the part of everybody to see to it that this does not escalate into. So therefore, trying to do everything is the order of the day. And the other issue is, of course, the European Union. I think that the war in Ukraine has forever changed the project of European integration. I think the future European Union will look very different. Yeah? It will move away from this, and this is, I say this in a critical way, from this kind of peace project, maybe too idealistic, but a response to the wars in Europe, which were in fact civil wars, European civil wars for many hundreds and hundreds of years, to something which will be more of where the military, where security will play a much, defense will play a much bigger role. And here I do hope that we'll not go into the trap of militarizing the European project, but see to it how we can deal with the soft power, smart power, and clearly the necessity for hard power is there. And will, whether we like it or not, become part and parcel of the future European project. There's another issue which the European Union needs to be concerned with, and this is, of course, where are the limits? What is the finalité of Europe, so to speak? Which countries in Eastern and Southeastern Europe? I'm talking about Turkey, I'm talking about Ukraine, of course, and I'm talking about Georgia, Moldova, which have already now somehow applied for membership. This needs to be handled in an extremely sensitive way, because I would not want to see a repeat of the NATO summit in 2008 in Romania, where some promises were made which simply were wrong, strategically wrong, and in many other ways, as we have seen now. Because in the end, NATO has been strengthened by this as an idea. Yeah, it is not brain dead any longer, as Monsieur Macron has pointed out, but it has obviously now even gained an attraction in Finland and in Sweden. In Austria, the situation is different, because our neutrality status, for some maybe irrational but interesting and in a way of course also positive reasons, has even gained more popularity in Austria. So this is a situation where so many things are in flux, but it will definitely have an impact on the European project, on enlargement in the European Union, as I have pointed out before, in particular in the Western Balkans.
Thank you so much, Wolfgang. We are already almost 10 minutes beyond our time limit. And thank you so much, Elias, for responding to some of the questions in the chat, such as whether sanctions are working, and harder sanctions would have prevented, after the annexation of the Crimea would have prevented a further step, and you responded to that, that actually sanctions, haven't worked so far in the history, looking in hindsight, that they have prevented anything like a war. And also the question of reconciliation was mentioned, and I think also I agree with you that it's probably too premature to talk about this, and then it's always difficult when it's imposed by outside actors. I think I would love to continue this conversation, because there are so many things we haven't touched upon. The question of neutrality was mentioned. I would have loved to ask about the neutrality of Finland, that is actually really bordering with Russia. And I know that in Finland, the question of membership to NATO has become more popular. How would that affect Russia's view on Finland? Many other things to be discussed. Turkey was mentioned, but also we didn't speak about the Pacific and the Asia question, and how if there is a pivot of Russia towards the east, towards China, how would that affect balances there? So many questions open for discussion, and I hope we can continue this conversation, but we have to finish because most of you have also other obligations, like Kristina will now have an interview with BBC, so we don't want to come across with BBC. And I think we should stop here. Thank you so much to all of you for your contributions. Thank you to the audience for your comments, and so sorry if we couldn't respond to all of your questions. As I said, many things have remained open, and we will continue this debate. Thank you to Cambridge, to Copenhagen, Helsinki, Moscow, and Wolfgang, you're outside of Vienna.
No, I'm back. I'm actually back in Vienna.
Okay, so
I had difficulties in the countryside with.
Greetings from Vienna to Vienna, then, in that case.
Yes. Okay.
Stay all healthy and safe, and hope to see you at another occasion. Thank you so much, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Cengiz?
Thank you. Ja.
Nur ganz schnell, wir müssen mal irgendwann wieder Catch-up machen.
Ja, total. Also,
wir sind mal wieder völlig behind.
wir haben uns schon so lange nicht gesehen, würde mich auch freuen. Machen wir uns doch einen Termin aus, wo wir uns vielleicht ohne Audience mal austauschen.
Ja, genau, also pass mal auf, ich weiß, wird jetzt alles recorded, ich schicke dir mal hier, ich habe in 2 Wochen Semester Super. Zu Ende, und dann wird sich schon
Bei
was
mir ist in 2 Wochen auch besser. Super. Ciao,
tschüss,
danke nochmal.
Danke dir.
Ciao.